من قسم الدراسات الآسيوية والإفريقية والبحر المتوسط بجامعة نابولي الشرقية. موضوع حلقة اليوم من محاضرة مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية بالرياض، إذا مع الأستاذ أندريا بريغاليا، سيكون عن بعض أوجه الثقافة العربية فيما كان يسمى تاريخيا بالسودان الأوسط، أي منطقة بحيرة تشاد التي تضم اليوم شمال نيجيريا وجمهورية النيجر وجمهورية تشاد وشمال الكاميرون. لأن هذه المنطقة تعود بدايات الثقافة العربية والإسلامية فيها إلى القرن العاشر والحادي عشر الميلادي، وهي المنطقة التي شهدت مملكة كانت تسمى بمملكة بورنو. هذه المملكة التي كانت فيها العديد من المراكز الثقافية العربية الإسلامية. التركيز سيكون عن تطور فن الخطاطة العربية في هذه المنطقة، ومن خلال هذا المحور سوف يلقي المحاضر أضواء أوسع على تاريخ الثقافة العربية والإسلامية في هذا الإقليم. ونحن في مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية وفي برنامج الدراسات الأفريقية لنا اهتمام خاص بموضوع العلاقات الثقافية العربية الإفريقية عبر التاريخ الذي كان تاريخا مشتركا باعتبار وجود ثقافة واحدة أو الكثير من المشتركات الثقافية بين العالم العربي وإفريقيا عموما، وخاصة شمال إفريقيا، شرق إفريقيا، وأفريقيا جنوب الصحراء. إذن الحضور الكرام، نبدأ المحاضرة مع السيد أندريا بريغاليا من نابولي. تفضل أستاذ بريغاليا،
بسم
الكلمة
الله
لك.
الرحمن الرحيم. I am indeed very thankful to Dr. Al-Ustadh Muhammad Spitli for having extended this kind invitation to me. And I am thankful to the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, especially to my friends and colleagues in the Program for African Studies. And I'm very honored as well to be here with you tonight. Today, I will try to share with you some of my research which touch on the script, al-Khatt al-Arabi, that is used in the region. I take just 1 second to share my PowerPoint before I continue. Could you please confirm that you are seeing the PowerPoint? Are you seeing it now?
أنا لا أرى العرض التقديمي.
Okay. Yes, screen share is. So let me start. What about now? Can you see it now, please?
أنا لا أرى العرض.
Here. You should be able to see it now if I'm not wrong. Is it correct?
Yes, it's okay. نعم.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. We will briefly touch on three aspects related to the study of the Arabic scripts of West Africa, and in particular of the Central Sudan, which is a region that has been perfectly introduced by Dr. Mohammed Asbitli in his introduction, so I will not need to speak much more about it. Three aspects related to paleography. What do we learn from the study of the scripts? And then about history, what the study of the script tells us about the history of the Muslims and of Islamic in the area, and about contemporary cultural practices. So questions related to how can anthropology and the study of cultural practices related to writing, especially writing the Quranic text in our cases, as we will see, how can these anthropological approach help us to reconstruct some aspects of the history of the practice of these scripts. First of all, we should start from one point of view, from one statement. A lot of scholars in the literature assume that in the whole of West Africa, from Senegal to Chad, and west to east, and from Mali to Ghana or the coast of Nigeria, there is one single script. This is an assumption that we find in a lot of literature concerning the region, that our researches, and I use the plural here, not as a trait of honor, but because part of this research has been conducted by me together with some colleagues, especially Dr. Mauro Nobili, whom I will mention when we will refer more directly to his work. If there is not one single script used, one single Arabic script, used in the whole of West Africa, then some characteristic features can be identified that can help us to locate the provenance of manuscripts within at least macro regions of West Africa, as we will see. The study of the scripts, of the Arabic script, can be an end in itself if you are a specialist of paleography. But in my case, I am not an purist of paleography, but I am using paleographic insights not as an end in themselves, but as instruments to inquiry on the origins of the Islamic civilization in the Western Sudan, and the orientation, the cultural orientation of Muslims in different regions of the Western Sudan. So basically, what were the most important influences that the Muslims of the regions, I would have to add Central Sudan here. This is a quote from an article by Bivar, who referred to the Western Sudan. In my case, I should add the Central Sudan. So my questions are also related to what do script styles tell us about the history of Islamic West Africa? I will keep it very brief. So the interpreter who is kindly helping us with his translation, if he has the PowerPoint in front of me, should know that from now on, for a few slides, I will be moving quite fast because it's not necessary to go into depth, but I would like to locate a little bit my study in a tradition that exists to show what are the ideas that I am trying to dispel and what are on the contrary, the intuitions of some of the past scholars that have dealt with this theme that I think were insightful. First of all, we find that a lot of the non-specialized literature So non-paleography, specialists of paleography, refers to all the African scripts as Maghribi. The Maghribi is a script that is characterized by the characteristics that I am showing here: the letter Kaf with one dot above, the letter Fa with one dot below, and a few other characteristics that it's not necessary to go into depth. But my main point here will be there are certain traits of some of the scripts of the Central and Western Sudan that are not shared with the Maghribi, the scripts of North Africa. Of course, what led many people to believe that the scripts of Western Central Africa are simply derivative of the Maghribi tradition is the fact that virtually all the scribes in the Western and Central Sudan adopted the characteristic pointing, dotting, the dots of the Maghribi, which is the Kaf, as you can see here in this example from Surah Al-Baqarah, the characteristic dotting of the Kaf with one dot above, Huda lil-Muttaqin, and the characteristic dotting of the Fa with one dot below the letter, as you can see in the verse below, Humul Muflihun. But this is a superficial characteristic that has to do with a choice that was made at some point in the development of the tradition, and that does not involve the shapes of letters as such. So paleography is more concerned with the shapes of the letters than with the dotting, where to put the points, the dots, to differentiate between graphemes, so letters basically, that are written in the same way, like ba, ta, tha, and qaf, fa, etc. This is a Quran from Borno in the Central Sudan, and this is a characteristic example of a pretty early Maghribi script. Beyond the dotting, the choice of where to put the dots of the Fa and the Kaf, there are very few paleographic features that are shared by the two. Now, if we turn to the specialized literature, there has been the tendency for a lot of time to use the term al-Khatt al-Sudani as a style that is characteristic of West Africa. So there was this idea, West Africa is different from Northwest Africa in terms of script style, but there is one single khat, which is called al-Sudani. For instance, Hudas, but here I will go very fast because I don't think that we should stop in all these technicalities that have to do with the history of the scholarship of the scripts. So gradually, especially in the West, the theory developed, so among Mustashrikun in general, the theory developed that there is a script called Sudani, which is spread all over West Africa. So from Senegal in the Atlantic coast to Chad in the Central Sahara, and from Mali in the north to the coast of the Gulf of Guinea. And also, a lot of authors argued that the Sudani is basically derivative of the Maghribi. Alternative taxonomies have been proposed by Bivar, by Hames, and by myself in some articles that I wrote together with my colleague Mauro Nobili, to whom I will refer a couple of times in this presentation. So in order to start thinking beyond the Sudani, or rather than beyond the Sudani, inside the Sudani, because we want to see the internal differences of the scripts, We also turned to the West African scholars who had been ignored. We asked the questions of what are the taxonomies that they use. So the West African khattatun themselves, what taxonomy do they use? What terms do they use to define the different styles? There are several projects like the Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation project on catalog and manuscript, where a lot of scholars from West Africa have been involved and they have used their categories. And we see that the categories that they use often refer to three styles: Sahrawi, Suqi, so al-Khatt al-Sahrawi, al-Khatt al-Suqi, and al-Khatt al-Sudani. So we have the perception coming from inside West Africa that there is more than one script used in the region, but still the term Sudani is used. Sheikh Hammu of Timbuktu, who is a calligrapher himself and also a scholar who has written books on the history of the ulama of the region of Timbuktu, has contributed an important, albeit very small book, Al-Makhtutat al-Arabiyya wal-Maktuba bil-Harf al-Arabi fi Sahel al-Ifriqi, in which he develops his definitions of these categories. Now, internal categories used by West African scholars are for us very important, but they are not necessarily the final word on the matter. So in our effort, we try to draw on the work of people like Sheikh Hammu and others to suggest that there is more than one script, but we also try to deconstruct the idea of the Sudani. So for us, the Sudani is a label, a name that should be abandoned. On the contrary, we suggest that at least two different Sudanis can be identified that exist alongside the Sahrawi and the Suqi. The one to which I will devote most of my attention, because it's the one that I have studied more closely, is the one that Mauro Nobiliendai choose to call the Central Sudanic Arabic script. We draw the name Central Sudan, of course, from a long-standing tradition of scholarship that Bilad al-Sudan al-Aswad that goes back to earlier Islamic and Arabic scholars, historians, and geographers, but which is also used in historical literature in English. For instance, the most important encyclopedia in the English language on Arabic literature of Africa is organized in a volume on the Central Sudan, a volume on the Western Sudan, and the volume on the Eastern Sudan. So we draw on an existing tradition. The Central Sudan, as already anticipated in the introduction to the talk by Dr. Spitli, corresponds more or less to the contemporary states of Niger, northern Nigeria, western Chad, and northern Cameroon. And it also corresponds more or less to the area of extension of a very important Islamic political entity, the Sultanate of Borno. And here I would like to suggest to the public that when we think about Islamic history, political history, cultural history, intellectual history, we need to think about a history where dynamics of centers and peripheries are very important, but the centers are always many. It is a multicentric cultural history. So just as we cannot consider Morocco with the Qarawiyyin in Fez as a periphery of the Muslim world, but we need to think about it as a regional center of Islam. In the same way, we should not make the mistake of think of Borno as a periphery of the Muslim world, but we should think of it as a regional center. So a place where for centuries, scholars, in our case also calligraphers, influenced their periphery, influenced the world that surrounded them. I started personally to get intrigued and interested in the study of these calligraphies when I worked at Northwestern University Library in Evanston, United States, and I was working on cataloging some literature of all kinds, poetry, books of fiqh, books of aqidah, etc., written by 20th century Nigerian scholars. And I was really intrigued by their scripts. The khat that they used seemed to me very consistent. And it seemed that it had a lot of variance of level from the more skilled calligraphers to less skilled calligraphers. And it did not seem to me that it was trying to imitate the Maghrebi, as a lot of the existing literature suggested. So I started to conceptualize this script as something different in 2007 when I started to work on these collections. This led to the publication of a first article, which was co-authored by me and Mauro Nobili, called Central Sudan. Sorry, this is part 2. There was 2 articles. I forgot to put the first. The first was on, part 1 was on the Kanawi, so the script of Kano, and the second one was on the Barnawi, the script of Borno. In this case, we are not speaking of 2 completely different scripts, but of 2 styles within one script tradition. So the shape of the letter is very similar in the Barnawi and the Kanawi. And together, they form what we call as the Central Sudanic Arabic script. But the style of writing, the writing style, is, as we will see in a few slides, slightly different. Now, in this image, we can see the historical consistency of the script. This script doesn't change much. It is a very coherent script tradition. On the left, we have a 16th, 17th century Quranic manuscript. So about 400 years ago. In the middle, we have an early 19th century correspondence, a risala, a political risala. And on the right, we have a 20th century Quranic manuscripts. So one first characteristic of this script is there is a lot of consistency in time along the centuries, and there is a lot of consistency between Quranic and non-Quranic variants of the script. So in this article, what we did was, as I said already, anticipated, we questioned the usefulness of the term Sudani as a generic label for all sub-Saharan scripts. Then we presented evidence of the existence of a specific script used in the Central Sudan in an area corresponding to the region that for several centuries was under the political or cultural influence of Borno. And finally, we revived a hypothesis that had originally been advanced by Bivar in the 60s, but that later had been dismissed by many researchers, which is that the script of Borno is a direct descendant of the North African Ifriqi. Now, what is the North African Ifriqi? the North African Ifriqi is the script that was used consistently in North Africa before the emergence of what we now call Al-Khatt al-Maghribi. The Ifriqi, which other scholars call the late Abbasid script, is basically a form of script that is closer to older Arabic scripts, now not used except in some calligraphic artists' pieces, which is what we normally call the Kufic, right? So for those who have some familiarity with the history of Arabic scripts, the Kufic are the first monumental scripts that are developed. Gradually, as people write more on paper, more and more on paper, which was not available in the first centuries of the history of Islam, the script become less monumental and less cursive. And 3, 4, 5 different khat develop. The Maghribi is the best known, the Maghribi, and of course the various Eastern scripts are the ones that are best known. Now, in our opinion, the Barnawi does not develop after the Maghribi, but develops directly from the Ifriqi. When? Most likely around the 10th, 11th century, which is exactly the time when the Muslims of Borno are Islamized. And it's a time when the Ifriqi was still the dominant script of North Africa. The Maghribi was not born yet. The Maghribi as we know it today. I can go back if we have questions on some of these issues. But for now, let me proceed. So this is my description of the Barnawi. The Barnawi is angular, is bold, and it is squat. It has a markedly horizontal baseline. The scribes tend to minimize curves in the horizontal baseline of the script. This aspect is the result of the regular spacing between individual letters and between words, of the shape of the graphemes that rest on a continuous, straight, horizontal baseline, and of the fact that in realizing some of the letters that have ascenders, so lines that go up, like lam, or even when you realize an ayn, everything that goes up is not emphasized too much. And this is very different from what we know from Eastern styles or calligraphy, but also is very different from the Maghrib. In the Maghrib, the alif is very long, and the lam is very long, etc. So all the letters tend to be almost of equal height, the lam and the ayn and the mim. They are intended to be like that. Other characteristics is that, to write this script, you need to use a column that has a flat tip with rounded edges. Here we see some letters that are characteristically different from the Maghribi. When a ba, ta, or tha is in the final position, it is left open to the left. Whereas in the Maghribi, there is a big hook, even bigger than in Eastern scripts, characteristically, that closes the final ba, ta, or tha. The denticle of the sin or shin are always perpendicular to the baseline, basically as a comb. Whereas in the Maghribi, they are realized as small curves. They are also relatively tall, so the denticles of the sin or shin, and they have the same height. Whereas in the Maghribi, the 3 denticles have descending height. The first is slightly longer than the second, and the second is slightly longer than the third. Then the fa, when it is initial and medial, it is always raised on a stalk like that. And it is not realized on the baseline as a curve, as the Maghribi Khattatin do. The final fa is also raised. So this is a final fa, the one that you see as a fourth letter on the left, is a final fa. It doesn't have a dot. It is raised to the baseline. It does not have a curve below, and it is left open to the left. I will stop here because for now, because these are sufficient characteristics. I will skip some sections here. Number one, we have some open questions, of course. Research has this. It's not a limit of research. Actually, it's the beauty of research. You always have open questions. We are not able to locate exactly the easternmost limit of the Central Sudanic or Barnawi script, somewhere at the borders between Chad and Sudan. But this needs further research. The region of Waddai, in particular, which is in eastern Chad, at the borders with Sudan, displays a script that is very similar to the Barnawi, but it has some characteristics that we never see in Barnawi manuscripts. And I will not describe them for now. Now I will go very fast before going to the contemporary calligraphic cultural practices of northern Nigeria, because I think this is also an interesting theme. I will go very fast, so please to Ustad Abdullah Haroun, be patient with me. I will be skipping a lot of slides from now, but I just want to say we have focused on the Central Sudanic scripts, and in particular on the Barnawi. So what about the other scripts? I will just show a couple of images. One is the Sahrawi. We agree with the use of the term Sahrawi because we see that there is a lot of consistency in a script that is used along the Western Sahara. And the Sahrawi, if compared to the Barnawi, is much more influenced by the Maghribi. This is quite clear. It is much more influenced from the Barnawi. I will go very fast, but basically the Sahrawi is the script that is dominant in Timbuktu, but we also find in areas like Arwan, and that we find in Mauritania and in the Moroccan Sahara region, as well as even in southern Algeria, in parts of southern Tunisia, basically in some of the manuscripts of the Jerid until a certain time, until the 18th, 19th century. It's called what is called the Jerid in Tunisia, and some parts of the Sahara. So basically, we tend to agree with the idea that the Sahrawi is a useful definition. But when we move further southwest, we find a script that has some similarities with the Barnawi, but is also quite different from the Barnawi. So when we move southwest, we have a third tradition of script, which we call the Western Sudan. So to display the full picture, I will continue to focus on the Central Sudanic, but to display the full picture, we believe that useful categories are Sahrawi, Western Sudani, and Central Sudani. They are quite useful to identify. There is another one, I had mentioned it earlier, it's called the Suqi, but the Suqi script, which is used by a specific clan of Amazigh Tuareg from the Sahara that specialize in Islamic scholarship. They are called the Kele Souk, and that's why it's called the Sukri script, it's quite limited in scope. So I will skip the slides on the Western Sudan. And now I'll go to the final section of my presentation. I will talk about what is happening in contemporary times. Most of my research started, as I described, I mentioned earlier, from contemporary calligraphers in Nigeria. So that's basically my biography. I was intrigued by not only by the content of the literature that was produced, the Arabic literature that was produced in Nigeria in the 20th century, but also by the distinctive script tradition. So I will add some methodological notes on how can anthropology help to reconstruct at least the more recent stages in the history of the development of the Central Sudanic scripts. And we need to start from here. So basically, we need to understand that a calligraphy is an art, but it does not come from above, especially in this context we are talking about, which is the West African context. It comes from below. So first, you have a practice of writing. Writing the letters in a certain shape is learned not because you want to become a calligrapher and an artist. It is learned because you are a child attending a Quranic school from the age of 4, and you are writing and rewriting your Quranic lesson on a lawh. So I turned to the Quranic schools of northern Nigeria, and I spent a lot of time with a lot of wonderfully welcoming teachers who allowed me to spend time with them and observe the writing practices. I cannot go into the learning and teaching practices. I will not go into the details here, but most of us have learned the Quran or learned the Quran from a printed book today. So we can be very passionate about our Quran and we can memorize it very well by reading and rereading and rereading and rereading. But we will not, the system of reading it from a book or from a computer or whatever, will not encourage us to practice the calligraphy. In a Quranic school where the lawh is used, on the contrary, you have to write and rewrite the text over and over again. And this is why we have already a pedagogical system that creates almost naturally calligraphers from a very tender age. Look at this boy. He's about 10, perhaps, 10 or 11. And if you look at the consistency of his handwriting, it is very remarkable. So some other aspects of the Quranic culture, of the culture of Quranic writing in northern Nigeria. There are schools that are attended by virtually every child. Every child attends a Quranic school in the region. Today, of course, many of the Quranic schools have changed methods, but the lawh is still widely used. But there are other schools that are attended and that are called Sangaya when after a student has already memorized the Quran. The question could be, if you have already memorized the Quran, why should you continue to attend a Quranic school? Shouldn't you perhaps go to study fiqh or aqidah? Well, many do that, but some continue to specialize in the Quran and they study something that is quite amazing that I show in this brief video.
Baddalu guda biyu ne, akwai wa ma baddalu ta badila, ni'imatallahi irin wannan sha ɗaya ce, kufuran a haka su huɗu ne, wa ahallu shi ɗaya ne, qaumahum su biyar ne, dara su uku ne, albawai shi ɗaya ne.
This is called harji in the Hausa language, and it is the knowledge of all the statistics concerned with the Quran. This is a specific knowledge that is acquired only by those who are already huffaz, and consists in memorizing how many times every Quranic word occurs in the Quran, or every combination of words. Baddalu tabdila, for instance, how many times. The statistics that are called harji can be never ending, because every scholar can know, for instance, how many times kitabun occurs and how many times kitabin, or perhaps another one can know how many times the word kitab is followed by an end of ayah marker, etc. So basically, there are some students that after completing memorization will continue to write and rewrite on their lawh, the Quran, so as to acquire from different scholars a number of information related to what is called harji. From one scholar, they will learn some, and from others, they will learn some more. So basically, through a study of the manuscript of the literature published in Kano in the 20th century and the careers of some of the calligraphers who wrote these editions that were then often photocopied or and printed, I realized that the style of writing that is used in the city of Kano today, or at least from the half of the 20th century, is also slightly different from what I have described above as the Barnawi. And that's where the idea comes that there is a central Arabic script, and then there are two main stylistic variants. One is the Barnawi, from within the family of Central Sudanic Arabic script. One is the Barnawi, which is the more ancient one, and the other one is the Kanawi, which is, in fact, quite recent, in my opinion. How can we describe the Kanawi? This is the Kanawi. Two different versions of the Kanawi. The Kanawi, so the script that is dominant in the city of Kano, exaggerates some of the features that we have observed in the Barnawi. Its characteristic squatness, it is more squat even than the Barnawi, right? You can clearly see it. There is a very thick horizontal baseline. It is realized by very elongated horizontal strokes of letters like kaf, sad, ta. It is often realized by using a column that is different from the rounded tip column that is used in the Barnawi. In this case, we have a slant tipped column, more or less like this highlighter, slant tip. And the way you realize the column is that when you write, you alternate very thin vertical strokes and very thick horizontal strokes, like you do with the highlighter when you want to underline or to highlight. Yep. Can I go on, or do I have, my time is over? I think 5 minutes.
ممكن يكون تستكمل. You can go on.
Okay, I think 5 minutes could be enough. In a more recent publication,
more.
tried, which was out in 2022, I have tried to develop these intuitions that were at the basis of my previous article on the Kanawi, because now I have much more data on the calligrapher. So basically I have at least 20, the knowledge of the life and career of at least 20 calligraphers whose mushafs have been printed and marketed. Perhaps I should, or I can do it later, take some of the copies that I have here of the Qur'ans that are written by hand by the Kano calligraphers and that are then printed and sold in Nigeria. And so I have tried to establish a full chronology of the Nigerian printed Qur'ans. The first one was printed in the end of the 1950s. So this is a history of about 70 years. And still more of these Qur'ans have been printed. So in this article, I tried to explore the social and economic links between the scholars, the leaders of the religious networks, the calligraphers who often work for the scholars, the Quranic schools, where the basic skills of writing are taught in a certain way that then produces the calligraphers, the printers, and the readers. The readers are very important. The fact that there is a public is the main reason why so many Quranic masahif are being printed in Nigeria in the script. Why is there a public for this specific Quran? The answer is very simple. Because a lot of Muslims in the region have studied the Quran on the Lawh, and they have studied it in the Khat, Bilad al-Sudani al-Awsat. So in the Khat that we have described. If you are used to that Khat, when you want to buy a copy of the Quran to read, recite daily, you will definitely be able to understand and to read a Quran that is printed in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, etc. So there is indeed a big market in Nigeria for the printed mushaf that comes from the Middle East. But at the same time, you will also prefer to have those that are printed in the script that you have started to be used to from your first year of Quranic school. I will now go again very fast, just to show some examples. The names are very important because for me, this is not an anonymous tradition. This is not a collective tradition. I mean, it is, in a certain sense, a collective tradition that is taught from the first years of Quranic schools, but when you arrive to the point of being asked to write a full Quran for publication, you put something of your own. And that's the reason why new copies of the Quran are being printed. For instance, using different colors or different decorations for the marginal markers. These markers are always functional to divide in the Quran, as we know very well. You know, this is a sajda, but many other markers like these ones, they are hizb markers. One hizb, one round, one circle. In other cases, we find different markers for Thumn al-Hizb, as we are used to that. We see them in all printed Qurans, but in the Nigerian tradition, they tend to follow a specific shape that is clearly recognizable by the public. So we have, I'll go very fast in some of those that have been printed. Another thing, perhaps, that I should add is that another reason why there are various editions of the Quran that are continuously being printed is because, as we have seen above, there is a section of the Nigerian public that is very interested in what I have called before as harji, which is a Hausa word, harji, the statistics about the words of the Quran. So when a calligrapher writes a new copy for the market, he will perhaps try to add different harji annotations that the Nigerian Quranic readers, they love this. In this case, for instance, but of course this is from one mushaf where you have hundreds of these type of notes. At the words alif lam mim dhalik al kitab, we have the notes that tells us that we have sitta fil Quran, 6 times alif lam mim dhalik al kitab, alif lam mim Allahu la ilaha illa huwa, etc. There are other examples, of course, of that, on that. In other cases, a calligrapher might perhaps try to have more striking geometrical decorations. These are all, I should stress, all the printed Qurans have not been written in Borno, but in Kano. So that's why the Kanawi, for me, is linked to the development of the printed editions of the Quran in the 20th century. I cannot go too much into that, but I'm giving you some glimpses, and perhaps in the comments, questions and answer session, I can go back to one or the other of your curiosities. So perhaps some of them might, of course, if you print a Quran, you want to sell it. You know, you should have your niyyah should be khalisa lillahi, but at least those who print the books might want to sell it. So they might ask the calligrapher, do something different for me. So in certain cases, there are some of the editions that have been printed from the 1950s to date that work on more elaborate markers. In this case, it is a marker of a subah. So besides marking all the his ahzab, as we know of the Quran, there are markers for the subah, for the 7th part of the Quran, and for the ruba, etc. I will skip this section because I want to leave some time for questions and answers. But here I have the biography of probably the most famous of all the calligraphers of Kano of the 20th century, whose name is Sharif Bala Gabari, who passed away in 2016, Allah yarhamu. And there are some reasons why the masahif that he penned, which are dozens, he wrote many copies of the Quran, many of which were printed, became particularly famous. But I will not discuss them now because I want to move to the conclusion. If you're curious, I can expand on that. Why Sharif Bala was considered by the public of Kano the best in his generation. This is always from his printed Qurans. There are always, as always, some open questions. So we've moved from the Barnawi, and I've said we don't know exactly where the Barnawi starts from and where it ends. Then we move to the Kanawi, the second variant style of Central Sudanic, Arabic script. So as far as the Kanawi is concerned, one question is, when exactly does it start to develop? I am very sure that it becomes popular only from the 1950s onwards, which is when there is an industry of printing Quran in the local scripts. And the calligraphers of Kano, because they are more closely related to the networks of Islamic scholars, of ulama, that are more popular at the time, and because they are close to the printing industry, they are those who start printing or sending their handwritten Quran to the printers. This is when it becomes popular, but when exactly does it start? It's an open question, because there are some samples of script like the ones that you can see now on the slide that are before the 20th century and which already display the characteristics of the Kanawi, which, as we can see in this example, is different from the Barnawi because it is clearly realized with a slant pointed pen, more or less like the highlighter, the example of the highlighter. So when exactly does it start is an open question. And I go to some of my conclusions. The Nigerian tradition of Quranic calligraphy is very ancient. And it is rooted in the material culture of scribes who use a script style that is unique in the Islamic world. And it has the most archaic features of all the script styles whose use has been transmitted continuously until today. So basically, it is the one that is more closely related to the Ifriqi, a script that was used, as I said before, until the 13th century, and it was then disappeared from most of the Muslim world. It's interesting that this calligraphic tradition has been able not only to survive, but also to flourish after the introduction of the press. And as we have seen, the reason why it flourished is that the public was still used to the script and was not familiar with the printed editions of the Quran that came from the Arab world. So they wanted new scribes, local scribes, to write beautiful copies of the Quran in the Central Sudanic Arabic script. And then these copies would be lithographed and printed. There is probably no other place in the Muslim world where such a numbers of Quranic manuscripts are produced by scribes on a daily basis. I can tell you that because of the way the system of Quranic education still works in northern Nigeria today, if you want to be called a Hafiz, you have to submit a full Quranic manuscript to your master that you have fully written without any mistake in the dots and in the ayah, etc., and in the vowels from beginning to end. And there are many who graduate as Huffaz according to this system. This means that besides the most beautiful ones that are produced for the press, there are also a lot of very ordinary Qurans, not necessarily beautiful, not necessarily decorated, but they are produced continuously, basically every day. Today, the scribes of Borno, so those who write with the Barnawi variant of the Central Sudanic, remain the custodians of a more purist tradition, while those of Kano, those who write with the Kanawi, experiment more and are more integrated in the dynamic of the market. Sorry for the typo here. There's no okay. Thanks. جزاكم الله خيرا.
شكرا أستاذ أندريا على هذه المحاضرة الثرية والجميلة والممتعة حقيقة. الآن إذن سوف نبدأ حلقة الأسئلة والأجوبة. إذا فيه من الحضور من يود أن يتدخل يمكن أن يرفع يده، وإذا البعض لديه سؤال يمكن أن يرسله كتابة إذا لا يريد أن يتدخل. فيها سؤال يتعلق بالناحية يمكن أن نقول التاريخية الأنثروبولوجية، يعني كيف نفسر أولا القطيعة مع الخطوط الأولى التي وصلت إلى المنطقة من جهة، ومن جهة أخرى كيف نفسر الانفصال بين بعض الخطوط حسب المناطق، يعني ما هي المراكز العربية التي أثرت؟ هل هي من شمال أفريقيا فما هي؟ هل هي من المغرب الأقصى أو من الجزائر أو من تونس مثلا أو من موريتانيا من بلاد شنقيط؟ هل هي مراكز مشرقية؟ هل هي من السودان مثلا أو من مصر أو من الحجاز؟ ثم كيف نشأت مراكز إفريقية في هذه المنطقة بالذات واتخذت لنفسها خط مميز؟ إذا هذا ما يتبادر للذهن. أولا المراكز العربية التي أثرت بشكل مباشر، ثم كيف تم الانتقال، يعني هل هو عن طريق مخطوطات أو وصلت إلى المنطقة أو عن طريق مدرسين جاءوا من شمال أفريقيا أو من الحجاز ثم أثروا في المنطقة، أو عبر رحلات تجارية، رحلات الحج. الناس انتقلوا مثلا إلى مكة ومن مكة أخذوا معهم بعض المخطوطات أو تعلموا بعض الخطوط هناك. لكن السؤال الأبرز هو كيف نفسر أو بماذا نفسر عملية الانفصال، يعني نشأة خط جديد. نعم، نشأة خط جديد كيف نفسره؟ يعني هذا ما لم أجده على الأقل.
This is
وأنت
a very important question.
نعم، تفضل هنا.
Thank you very much, because this is a very important question, very big, but very broad, but very important. So a fundamental question. So first of all, we can see, we have observed a difference in two African script tradition. One, the Sahrawi, Timbuktu, Mali, also Mauritania, Bilad Shinrit, etc. And another one, more central Sudan, Borno, and the surrounding area. And we have observed that the first one is much closer to what we call today Al-Khat Al-Maghribi. I can perhaps go back to some of the very first slides. Sorry for going so fast, but if we go very fast, we can reach it. So we can say that the scripts of the Sahrawi script, so Timbuktu, Mali, etc., has been more heavily influenced by this one that you see here, Al-Khatt al-Maghribi. Whereas we observe that the characteristics of the Bornawi cannot derive from this, but must derive from something that was used earlier, which is, let's call it Al-Kufi, so to understand each other. So number one, this tells us that not only the Islamization, but also the use of Arabic scripts in Borno was very early. And this is an important question, an important historical statement, because we don't have very early manuscripts. And why we don't have them? It cannot be because the people of Borno did not know how to use the Arabic script. Why do I say that? Number one, all the travelers, the Arab travelers who travel to Borno, they tell us that it's full of Quranic schools. And the Quranic schools must have been more or less like the ones we've seen today, allow writing and rewriting. Number two, we already find at the end of the 12th century Miladia, we find a scholar from Borno, it's called Ibrahim bin Yaqub al-Kanemi, who travels to Morocco, is hosted by the Sultan, and the Sultan asks asks him to sit with the ulama of, I think it was at that time, I'm not sure what was the capital of Morocco, of the Saadis, I think. But with the ulama of the court of the Sultan. And in this sitting, the alim from Borno, so we are talking about the end of the 12th century. In this sitting, he recites qasaid, enters into a poetic competition. And it is unthinkable to me that an environment where people, where the masses, where a large amount of people did not learn to write in Arabic, could produce an alim that writes Arabic qasaid. It's inconsistent. It's not possible. Someone who is a literate and is considered as a peer by the scholars of Morocco of the time cannot have been produced by an environment where there was not Arabic literacy. This means, is another proof, besides the paleographic, the origin of the script, which I've described, derived from a model that was used in the 11th century. So this is a further proof of the fact that even if we don't have manuscripts from that time, we have, we must have had writing. People were writing. Now the question is why we don't have manuscripts? And the answer has been given by a lot of scholars. Number one, the climatic conditions of the central Sahel are very different from those of, if you go up in the Sahara or you go to North Africa, they have very different conditions. We have a very dry season of about 9 months, where the climate is more or less like in most parts of Saudi Arabia. And then we have a very wet, rainy season, where it rains every day and it's very, very humid. Some scholars have tried to expose paper, replicating in a laboratory and accelerating over time, replicating the amount of impact that this humidity, alternation of humidity and dryness has on paper. And they've realized that one leaf of paper in normal conditions in this context does not live for more than 200 years. So what was done is, when manuscripts used to get old, people simply rewrote them because they get wet, they get damp, and they simply recopied them. That's why we don't have original manuscripts. The exceptional cases, we go to the 17th century, so 1,600 years after Miladi. But certainly there were people who were writing well before that time. Another reason is the ulama of the region used, even if the Sultan was a Muslim, used to have a very strong tradition of staying away from the sultans, not staying too close to the sultans, independence. They were very well organized in families. So the son of an alim was most likely an alim himself, and his son, but they were not organized into established madrasas funded by the sultans. This is not very common, although there are exceptions, but it's not very common in the history of the region. What does this mean in terms of preservations of manuscripts? It means that when an alim dies, his manuscript collection, which is private, number one, he doesn't have a lot of funds to preserve them. So where does he keep them? I can show you perhaps some examples. Perhaps you can see some of those bags that are hanging from the wall of my house. These bags, leather bags, are normally the bags that are used to preserve manuscripts in the region. Not a building, a library, etc., but private collections, which can easily deteriorate over time. Rats can eat the books. This was the normal condition before modernity, and that's why one of the reasons why we don't have very old manuscripts. But paleography and history suggest that literacy was present. As far as the second part of the question, and thank you very much, Dr. for posing this very important question, which is what was the contact? The contacts that favor the Islamization of the region, first came the traders. The first who came were the traders. So trading was a big, big impulse to the Islamization of Sahel al-Ifriqi, basically the Sudan. Of course, along with the traders came the first ulama. But there is a very important thing that happens in West Africa, which is that as far as we can go back in time, most of the established ulama families, they are locals. They are not outsiders. So even if, for sure, in the first centuries, 11th, 12th, 13th, we must have had North African scholars accompanying some traders who are doing the trade with the Sudan and perhaps settling. We have very famous ones later on, Al-Maghili from today's Algeria. Of course, we have some, but the major established networks of ulama, they are locals. They use local languages also, which are gradually Islamized because they are used to translate orally the Quran, the Kutub al-Fiqh, Kutub al-Aqidah, Kutub al-Qasa'id al-Arabiya, etc. So the languages also are gradually permeated with Arabic influences. And especially in Borno, the tradition develops autonomously from probably at least the 13th century. And this is why, because the tradition is autonomous and becomes a center of its own that feels as if it is relatively independent, although it has contacts with the rest of the Muslim world, the script maintains specific characteristics. Thank you very much, Prof. This was a question that allowed me to add something very important.
هل توجد معطيات حول نشأة صناعة تابعة لفن الخطاطة وتطور فن الخطاطة؟ أقصد هنا مثلا صناعة الورق، يعني من أين كانت تأتي هذه البضاعة، هذه السلع الورق؟ هل هو إنتاج محلي أم أنها تأتي من المراكز الحضارية والثقافية العربية من جهة، ومن جهة أخرى هل يعني هناك مواد تستخدم في الكتابة وصناعة الأقلام محلية أم أنها مستوردة؟ وهل أسهم هذا في ازدهار نوع من التجارة يعني
Absolutely.
تفضل.
This is another question that I welcome very much because it gives me an opportunity to put a little bit of حب الوطن in this presentation of mine. I am an Italian, so we can certainly say that in the 18th and 19th century, where the vast majority of the manuscripts produced in the region of the Central Sudan have been actually written, those that are available. As I said before, literacy was used before that time. Manuscripts did not survive, but those we have are the vast majority from the 18th, 19th century, and all the paper comes from Italy. So I'm very happy that now I can mention my country, at least towards the conclusion of my presentation. In particular, they come from area of northeastern Italy, where a type of paper was produced that was not necessarily the best, but was the cheapest. So Africa did not produce a technique for the production of paper, but Africans were eager to buy paper. We know already, I think it must have been Ibn Battuta during one of his travels to Timbuktu, who was astonished by how much the people of Timbuktu in Africa could spend for a load of paper. I think it was him, I will have to check. But one of the famous travelers who traveled to Timbuktu stressed that it costed so and so amount of paper, costed the same amount of money you would spend for a horse or to slaves, something like that. At that time, I'm not sure, of course, it was coming from Italy, probably not. But in the later centuries, 18th, 19th, it all came from northeastern Italy because it was cheaper. Italy started to develop some techniques for mechanic production of paper. Also, the northeastern Italy is very close to Venice, which was always a very important port for trade with the Arab world. And also the travels that this paper made, for me, are very nice because they are also a statement of the multi-faith world in which these people lived. The reason I'm saying that is that the mills, the producers of the paper, were all Italian Christian families. The traders that bought this paper in Venice and brought it to Tunis, Al-Khadra, or to Trablus, Philippi, were mostly Jews, Jewish families from North Africa, mostly. And their history has been reconstructed. But then the Jewish traders, they would not make the trip towards the Sahara, because to make the trip across the Sahara, you need to be into solid networks of ulama, of traders, of families that are dominated by Muslims. So it was Muslim North African traders who bought this paper in the markets of Tunis or Trablus, and then brought them down directly through the region of the Lake Chad. So this allows me to respond about paper. As far as other tools are concerned, it is important to remember that for most part of the history of literacy, paper was, because it was very expensive, it was used only for very important books. The ordinary writing was done on loha. So in other sets of publications of ours, we try to reconstruct what is the wood that is used, who works the wood, the inks. The inks are all entirely still today made from local recipes. And there are many local recipes that are used to produce the ink, and different types of ink, some that are good for writing in the loha, and some that are good for writing on the paper. And the calligraphers, in most cases, Nigerian calligraphers today produce their own ink. As far as the qalam is concerned, the qalam is very easy to realize. So as I said, there are two variants of qalam. So one is a more rounded tip and another one has a more slant tip. And these are realized quite easily, even by a child of 6 years who starts attending a Quranic school today in northern Nigeria, knows how to cut a qalam. But of course, paper is totally another story, because as I said above, paper was not produced locally and was always quite expensive, which is one of the reasons why writing on the Loha continued to be so important until today, basically. Well, today is more for cultural reasons. Today, paper is, of course, cheap paper from India, from China, is available every day. Today, it is not a problem of the paper being available, but it's a fact that people have been used for generations to study the Quran in this way. They believe that they learn it better by studying on the Loha, which I think might be true, although I haven't tried myself, but I have observed the quickness with which it is memorized, probably simply because when you have a Loha in front of you and you have to memorize everything that is written on it before washing it, then you will concentrate more. When I have a mushaf in paper, the temptation is flipping a page before having memorized what I have in front of me. So I think the reason might be very easy, easily explainable. But thank you, Prof.
شكرا. هناك سؤال لكن في جانب خاص بك أنت، يعني هل اهتمامك العلمي هذا الذي يبدو ليس علمي فقط، لكن يبدو أنه فيه شغف خاص بهذه المنطقة وبهذه الفنون، هل هذا يعود إلى أن لك ارتباط خاص في حياتك بهذه المنطقة أو بهذه المجتمعات أو بهذه الثقافة؟ يعني هل هناك تفاعل ثقافي بينك وبين هذه المنطقة أدى بك إلى التخصص والتعمق والسكن في هذه المناطق والبقاء أسابيع وأشهر وأنت تشتغل على الوثائق؟ هل هناك علاقة خاصة بهذا يعني يمكن أن تفيد بها السامع؟
Thank you very much. Even if this is a personal question, I feel very comfortable and at ease with my friends at King Faisal Center. So I will be very happy of sharing with you a couple of words on that. I hope I will not be long, because otherwise I will become boring with my story. But I can say that personally, I developed an interest on Africa and on Islam in my childhood. And probably the reason was something that remained in my unconscious when I traveled to Somalia with my father. My father was an ustad of mathematics, and he worked in an exchange program with the University of Mogadishu. It's before the war. So at that time was quite peaceful. And we spent time there. I was too little to remember much, but probably for some reason, from my early childhood, I had a very strong interest both on Islam as a religion, which led me in 2002 to embrace the Islamic religion, and also for Africa, which led me to study more about Africa. Today, I'm very happy to have a Nigerian Hausawi زوجة and أربعة أولاد إيطاليون نيجيريون. So I can say that yes, it has also become personal to some extent. But I try in my writings to my personal interest to motivate me. It motivates me, but I try to let it not interfere too much, because I believe that my work, especially the historical dimension of my work, must have a professional appeal, and that it must be sound and interesting for everyone, irrespective of what is their religion or thinking, etc.
شكرا لك أندريا. إذا وجميل أن تشاركنا أيضا هذه التجارب الشخصية التي أسهمت في تكوينك العلمي، لأن تقريبا كل الذين تخصصوا في مثل هذه المجالات تربطهم بصورة أو بأخرى بهذه الحقول المعرفية وهذه المجالات الجغرافية علاقات تبدو خاصة في بعض الأحيان. هذا إذن واضح جدا. أنا درست في فرنسا على يد أستاذ فرنسي في الماجستير والدكتوراه، كان يقول أنه من أبناء الأقدام السمراء، وهذا الذي جعله يتخصص في تاريخ شمال إفريقيا، ويقصد بالبينوار، يقصد نعم بالأقدام السمراء هم هؤلاء الأوروبيون الذين ولدوا في شمال إفريقيا في العهد الاستعماري، وبعد ذلك بقي له علاقة خاصة مع المغرب العربي، وبالتالي لما كبر وأراد أن تخصص في تاريخ شمال إفريقيا والمغرب العربي. فهناك دائما لدى المثقفين والمتخصصين علاقات خاصة بمجالات تخصصهم، قد تكون اختيارات في حياتهم ثقافية أو إيديولوجية، ولكن أيضا قد تكون نتيجة تاريخ يربطهم بهذه المنطقة وبهذه الثقافة. فأشكرك على إذا مشاركتنا هذه التجربة الخاصة، وكذلك أشكرك على هذه المحاضرة الثرية، ونتمنى أن تكون تتاح لنا فرصة نستضيفك في مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية، تكون فرصة لمعرفة والاطلاع مباشرة على المملكة العربية السعودية، ولعلها تكون فرصة بالنسبة إليك تزور البقاع المقدسة بما أنك مسلم، تكون فرصة. أنت لم تزر مكة أو تعتمر يوما ما يعني حسب ما علمت.
I haven't visited the blessed lands of the peninsula yet. I would be extremely honored to have a chance to visit you, but I also want to stress that the same is true on my side, that I would be also honored to have you, Professor, or some delegates from your center to also visit us one day as soon as we find an occasion, some possible conferences or other scientific activities. It would be really an honor to also welcome you in our university. So thank you very, very much. And thanks for the audience who has patiently listened to me through this time.
هناك سؤال من الدكتور سالم مصطفى جاءني متأخر، إذن يقول هل يمكن القول أن الخط العربي هو الواسطة الوحيدة للديانة والتجارة بالمنطقة في القرن الحادي عشر والثاني عشر، أو ابتداء من القرن الحادي عشر والثاني عشر، وهو الأستاذ الدكتور سالم مصطفى من الجزائر؟ إذن هذا السؤال موجه لكم.
The answer is, oh, by the way, I must say that I'm very happy that I am understanding each and every word of the questions in Arabic that are being posed. This promises well. I hope my tongue will also become more used to the practice, and one day, inshallah, I'll be able to deliver some exchanges with you in Arabic as well. So yes, thank you for this question. And the answer is a very strong yes. The Arabic language and Arab literacy in Arabic was the major tool for communication and for the creation of wider networks of people in trade and in intellectual life. So much so that an American scholar, John Hanwick, who has done a fantastic work. Actually, he has laid the foundation for the work that myself and other colleagues try to do now. So John Hanwick said that Arabic, for many centuries, has been the Latin of West Africa. What he meant by that is that just that like in medieval Europe, let's say for most of the history of Europe, Latin was the language that allowed an intellectual and political elite to communicate, to write philosophy and letters, diplomatic letters, etc. The same was for Latin in the history of West Africa. So my answer to the question of our distinguished friend is a very resolute yes, indeed.
إذن وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه المحاضرة. حقيقة استفدنا كثيرا منك دكتور أندريا، ونشكرك على الدعوة أيضا لزيارة جامعتكم. إن شاء الله سيكون ذلك. في النهاية إذن نشكر الحضور على حضورهم معنا في هذه الأمسية، ونشكرك مجددا. المحاضرة كانت ثرية وماتعة حقيقة، ونتمنى أن نلتقي مع الحضور ومعكم في فرصة أخرى. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.